Series, let's talk about the Mayan civilization, probably the better known out of the civilizations in the classical Americas. They, as we can see here, they were located on the Yucatan Peninsula, so slightly south and east of the Teotihuacan Society, which we just talked about. They also originated in an earlier period, so their time frame really, we could say, started in period 1. They originated around 1500 BCE in this area where some people of Mayan descent started to establish small settlements, but the civilization reached its peak around 250 CE and declined around 900 CE. So that's why we place them in the classical period of history. At their peak, they stretched over parts of southern Mexico and also what is now Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. Most of them lived in they actually had about 40 different cities in the Mayan civilization, and they ranged considerably in size. The cities had anywhere between 5,000 and 50,000 people in them, so they could be quite large in size. In the entire Mayan civilization, we suspect that they had as many as 2 million people living there. So a very, very high population, which rivaled many of the Eurasian societies that we've already talked about. They thrived on agriculture, but their agriculture technique was fairly unique, and they incorporated it because of the climate that they lived in. What really makes them stand out is that they use this method called slash and burn. And so this is an artist's rendering of what it looked like. With slash and burn agriculture, the Mayan people actually first, they cleared out forests in order to plant their crops. They would cut down trees and then they would burn everything in that region, and the ashes that resulted from these fires actually fertilized the soil. And one thing that I always thought was interesting is that some crops and plants actually have adapted to slash and burn agriculture, and they only germinate when they are exposed to fire. I always thought that was kind of cool. They also terraced their farms, which we can see here. This is something that we also see in the Andes mountain civilization. So this is not unique to the Mayans. But basically what terraces are they're like these steps that they create. Basically this allows you to still farm even if you live in an area that is sloped or hilled, right? Because if you kept the slope in place, then anything you watered would basically run downhill. It would make it very difficult. It's much easier for you to have flat ground to farm on. So they artificially created these flat levels so that they could plant on them. We're going to see that they're actually even more significant for mountainous civilizations because the slope was so severe. They also drained swamps and built irrigation systems to water their crops. We've seen this in other American civilizations and actually Eurasian ones as well. Their crops, again, the big one is corn. Then they also grew beans and squash. Sometimes we call these the Three Sisters because they're the most popular crops, and they sustained a pretty significant population. And they also hunted. They mainly ate deer for meat, and actually eventually they learned how to raise deer. So they sort of domesticated them, so it was easier for them to get them to turn into meat. They didn't have to hunt them. We did see that there was a sexual division of labor. The men tended to seed and harvest, as you can see actually here. And then women worked normally to prepare food, and they also, if they did domesticate deer, women would be in charge of raising them. So we also, just like the Teotihuacan society that we just talked about, the Mayans did have some significant cities with notable architecture. Their cities were made out of stone, limestone to be specific. They actually really only used stone tools to build these, so it's pretty amazing that they were able to build structures so large with such a limited technology. These cities had temples, palaces, and plazas that were used for public gatherings. And the most important temples were always located on the top of these pyramids. The idea behind that was that at the height of these pyramids, or at the top of them, you were the closest to the heavens and the gods. And oftentimes the religious ceremonies involve things like human sacrifices. So if you were giving an offering to the gods, you wanted to be close to them. The pyramids were up to 200 feet high, so that's as tall as a 20-story building. And I wanted to use pictures that actually have people in the foreground so you really can see the scale. Pyramids also served as observatories for Mayan astronomers, and as we're going to talk about in a future slide here, the Mayans had a significant understanding of astronomy for their time, and so by being able to go up to the top of these structures and view the stars, they could gather quite a bit of data for them to design calendars, to really understand some of the major natural forces that shape their year, the weather patterns, eclipses, moon cycles, things along those lines. The Mayan government was decentralized, so we've talked about that in places like Greece. So it was organized into city-states. That should say states, not stated. Some of them, well, first off, each city-state was either ruled by a local king, or sometimes priests and nobles could have major power. Sometimes they took on leadership positions in these city-states. So a city-state, just like in ancient Greece, it was the city itself, but also the surrounding territories. So you could think about it like cities and suburbs. Most of these city-states were ruled by men, but there were times when there would be no male heir, or if he was also, maybe he wasn't old enough to govern yet, women could rule city-states if that was the circumstance, which is significant. You know, we've definitely studied societies in this era where women have very little to no power. It was fairly frequent for these city-states to fight one another, and if they did go to war, the winner would occasionally absorb the loser into their city-state. Now, we found actually that it's fairly rare for these city-states to fight one another over territory. They didn't really care about expanding. But rather, one of the reasons actually why they fought each other was because they would demand tribute from one another, which is basically a payment for protection. Now, if a city-state declined to pay tribute to another, then they could go to war with one another. And also, if you were a conquered city-state, then oftentimes you would then pay tribute to whoever defeated you, essentially for their protection, and it was always the inferior state that would be paying the tribute and the larger state that would be receiving that tribute. Sort of like a tax, actually. So also we would see that when there was a war between city-states, if anyone was taken as captive, they oftentimes were the people that were used as human sacrifices during religious ceremonies. Mayan kings themselves believed that they descended from the gods, which is significant because we, first off, could connect it to societies we've already studied, like ancient Egypt, as well as the idea that there is essentially a form of divine right that shapes the government. The leaders of the Mayan societies also believed that they rejoined their ancestor god after death, so burial ceremonies also could be quite intricate. You could be buried with wealthy riches, and of course, your social rank could be indicated by the way that you were treated after your death. The kings of the Mayan societies would direct activities of the priests, who also administered the affairs of the state. So priests could be quite powerful, but ultimately they were subject to the kings, who were seen as the highest power. Now, normally royal rule would pass from father to son, so it was essentially a hereditary monarchy. But sometimes you would see that if a king lost the popular support of their city-state, they could be overthrown. So sometimes we had periods of civil war. And the government, lastly, was paid for by taxes. Now, people did not pay taxes in the form of currency usually. They would usually actually give the government crops. But this would feed, obviously, people who worked for the government. And because they received these taxes, and also another form of tax was through labor. The common citizens were meant to work for the government in some way. It could be that they built temples, it could be that they helped dig irrigation ditches, things like that. but taxes in the form of crops and labor basically helped pay for a government that grew quite significantly in size. The taxes also paid for an army if there was a war, because city-states never had standing armies in times of peace. And so if they went to war, it was expected first off that the citizens would serve for the military, but also that they would pay for it in their taxes. So again, to conclude with Mayan government, the idea was that it was not centralized, right? City-states were essentially independent in nature, but sometimes one city-state could become more powerful than others and then start to dominate over its neighbors and receive tribute from them. Mayan religion really was the center of Mayan life. They believed essentially that there were two different types of existence. There was the life as we know it, the physical life that they were currently living, but there was also the other world, or the afterlife. So that was a spiritual world of the gods where the souls of ancestors and other supernatural creatures lived. So the afterlife was just as, if not more important than the physical life. So they did believe that whatever you did in the present life could affect the afterlife. Mayan kings believed, again, that they were both political and spiritual leaders. And so the Mayan people, when practicing their religion, oftentimes would give offerings to the gods to try to satisfy them so that they would have a good place in the afterlife. There were huge temples and pyramids that were built where thousands of Mayan citizens could gather for special religious ceremonies and festivals. Again, we see that some of these festivals involved human sacrifices. We see here this is a bloodletting ceremony. It's happening on the top of one of these Mayan temples, again, because it's closer to the gods. Again, the people who were sacrificed in these ceremonies oftentimes were people who were held captive after a war. So something that was seen as troublesome, I suppose we could say, once European civilizations came in contact with these people. The Mayans were also polytheistic. The most important gods that they worshipped were the gods of the sun, the rain, and a corn god. So everything was really related to agriculture and nature, just like many early polytheistic religions that we've already studied. And another thing that's interesting about the role of women, so again, we do see that there's opportunity for leadership in some indigenous American societies for women. They could serve as priests, which is interesting. We don't really see that in the Eurasian societies so much. And also, at least one of the Mayan gods was a female. She was the goddess of the moon. And priests were very significant in Mayan society, and they could have leadership roles in the governments in many circumstances. Another thing that's interesting about Mayan religion is that we see that there was a sort of sport that evolved that shows us the significance of religion. It was called Poptotalk, which sometimes is compared to present-day soccer, although it's not equivalent exactly to that. In Poptotalk, it was actually sort of a hybrid between basketball and soccer, I guess you could say. So basically, in this ball game, there were these rubber balls in a walled court. We could see this is the artist rendering. This is the remains of one of them. The rubber ball would be bounced from one side to the other of this walled court, and the religious significance was that every time the ball went back and forth, that was signifying the struggle between the present life and the afterlife. And the people who lost the game of Poptotalk could actually end up being sacrificed in a religious ceremony. So it also could be a game of life and death for the Mayan people. The other thing about Mayan religion, we know quite a bit about it because of the art that remains from the Mayan peoples. So there were images on Mayan temples, sacred objects, and pottery that tell us quite a bit about their religion and their gods. And so oftentimes the themes of human sacrifice and bloodletting are part of these representation, these artistic representations. So sort of troubling for us to see, but significant nonetheless, that humans oftentimes were people who were brought up as offerings to the gods. Last thing about the Mayan civilization that we should certainly know about, actually we'll talk about decline too, so second to last thing, is that the Mayans were well known for their significant scientific achievements. They were sometimes called the Greeks of the New World because they were, as we already know, the Greeks gave birth to many forms of philosophy and education, so the thinkers like Socrates and Plato. We see that the Mayans also were seen as pioneers with some of their scientific discoveries. Actually, a lot of their science was linked to religion. The idea was that they were meant to have a greater knowledge of the heavens to better understand how to plan agriculture. They learned about astronomy so that they could accurately predict the calendar year, so that they knew the best time to plant and harvest crops. Also, their knowledge of astronomy allowed leaders to try to predict when the time was right for war. Some of the best astronomers of the early times actually came from the Mayan period, which is interesting because they didn't have any telescopes then. They essentially only used observatories and the naked eye. So again, these high Mayan temples, in addition to being the location for religious ceremonies, they also were used as observatories. We also see that priests were able to accurately use their knowledge of astronomy to predict eclipses and moon phases, and they had a calendar that they used again to plan out agricultural cycles, and their calendar was actually more accurate than most of the European calendars that existed at that time. They also engaged in advanced studies of mathematics. They too, just like the Indian people that we studied previously in this period, they understood the concept of zero, and they also could conduct calculations that totaled in the hundreds of millions. So pretty significant mathematical knowledge. And lastly, they were one of the only American societies that we know of that had a writing system. So their writing system, like the Egyptians, was one that used hieroglyphics, so very difficult to translate, and also something that was very complex. And so so we can infer from that not every person in Mayan society could read and write, that you had to have a specific profession. You really had to become a scribe and be trained to be able to be literate in the society. But nonetheless, these hieroglyphs oftentimes depicted important stories of the Mayan people. They wrote genealogies of their kings and royal families. They wrote down mythical stories. They wrote down their history. They wrote down trade networks. And so their writing system certainly was a good way for them to keep records in their society. And also we know that they decorated their buildings, they decorated pottery, they decorated monuments with their history and other messages. So it was important for them to write things down. They wanted their legacy to live on. So the Mayans, just like all the other American societies we've talked about in this video series, we're not entirely sure what caused them to collapse, so we can infer from that it was a gradual decline, not anything monumental that happened overnight. They declined around 900 CE, so they had a really, really long run, right? Their height was 200 to 900 CE, but the original Mayan people started to settle in that area around 1500 BCE, so they were around for over 1,000 years, a very, very long time for a society to last. So one of the suspicions that historians think is that there was overpopulation, and that was one of the things that led to the decline of the Mayan peoples. That cities started to become overcrowded, and there no longer was enough agriculture to sustain them. Another theory that about what caused their decline was that there was considerable deforestation and environmental damage and soil erosion. We've talked about this in other societies. And this could go along with overpopulation, right? Once you have a significant population to feed, you start to disrupt the natural environment of your surroundings because you need more land to farm. So you're doing things like cutting down too many trees. You are farming land that probably isn't as fertile as the land that you should be farming on. So soil erosion results, and ultimately this is going to make your land less sustainable. As cities crowded, there is suspicion that some Mayans actually started to abandon them, and they started to live farther away from cities and return to a more rural lifestyle where they essentially engaged just in subsistence farming. They were not farming a surplus anymore. And the other thing that we know that suggests a more gradual decline is that there are still people that live in this region today that were descended from Mayans. So again, it wasn't like the population went extinct. They simply evolved into a different kind of society over time. So today there are more than 7 million people in this region that speak a variety of languages that could be linked back to the Mayan people. So again, they did not collapse, they simply evolved over time. The current religious beliefs also of the people that live in this region are a mix between Mayan beliefs, so the more polytheistic, the more naturalistic types of religions, as well as Roman Catholicism, which is a very interesting blend. But the reason why Catholicism also exists in this region is because when Spanish explorers and settlers ended up in this region, many times they also brought missionaries and priests with them to try to convert the local population. Oftentimes they did this in a forced manner. But nonetheless, again, the idea is that the Mayan people did not collapse per se. They just simply they simply had to move on because their large-scale urban population no longer could sustain itself. But nonetheless, what we will talk about in the future period is how essentially this is going to become a more common theme. In period 3, we're going to look more at the contact between the indigenous societies of the Americans and the European explorers. So in a lot of ways, we see this is more of a collapse of these indigenous societies because, as we know, the European explorers oftentimes also had goals of conquest. And so this is when a lot of these societies start to decline and oftentimes disappear. So that is it for the indigenous American civilizations of the classical era. We will move on with classical African societies next, and we are almost finished with period 2. So awesome job with that, guys, and thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.